Let the waters teem with swarms of living creatures. Now, the articulation continues through the rest of the verse. And let birds fly above the earth in the open expanse of the heavens. And then it follows with the note that God created in verse 21. So the articulation goes through the end of verse 21. Now, when it speaks of these swarming creatures, literally, it could be translated, let the swarmers swarm, or the living swarms swarm. The Hebrew word is identical, the noun and the verb. In fact, it's a play on words in the Hebrew text. So we have these swarming or these strange creatures. What are they? The Hebrew word, sheretz, for those of you that have a little bit of Hebrew. The text here, it speaks of the relationship to waters. So very definitely, obviously, I think what is in view here are marine creatures. And probably, maybe most of the varieties of marine creatures, maybe not all of them, but on day 5 we have the creation of water creatures. Now, I mentioned and made the point that life does not begin in the oceans, but now we have life in the oceans or bodies of water. Life begins on land. God created plant life. But now He goes to move to create marine creatures, which would include predominantly fish, primarily the fish. So these would be swarming creatures, and they do swarm. In other words, they come in schools, many of them, large numbers of them. So it looks at fish, and it probably could include amphibians, because they seem to creep and swarm, the idea of the word here. So we have fish of all variety, and perhaps fish like stingray, and you can name all the different varieties. Here's just a few photographs. But not only does it include these marine creatures and perhaps amphibians, but if you do a word study and look up all of the usages of this word sheretz, it refers to other interesting animals in other contexts as well. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they were created on this day, but this word can include, and perhaps they may have been created on this day as well, or they may have been created on day 6. It's not totally clear because of the idea of the waters that are present in the verse there. But it also might include reptiles because of some of the other passages. In fact, let me show you some of them. For example, in Leviticus 11:29, it says, "Now these are to you the unclean among the swarming things," or sheretz. And then it goes into a list of some of these unclean animals. And in the list, it says, which swarm on the earth. Now, in this context, it's on the earth. And it includes reptiles. It includes the moles. And it also says, and the mouse and the great lizard in its kind. So at least the word itself includes a variety of swarming type animals. Now, I'm not sure if that's the intent in Genesis 1 where God created, but we know ultimately He created all things, so ultimately God created these as well. The issue is whether it's on day 5 or perhaps day 6, because there are similar descriptions of perhaps some of these animals on the next day. There's another passage that refers to insects. Leviticus, the same context, Leviticus 11:20, and it says, all the winged insects, but the word is sheretz. New American Standard translates it insects that walk on all fours are detestable to you. So it's an unclean animal, certain insects. So it could include insects as well. So we have mice and moles. Now, the text also refers to them as nephesh, or living creatures, or something associated to the word that sometimes is translated soul in the Old Testament. Now, the concept of soul is not the concept that we generally think of, because it refers to animals as having nephesh. So it's not the soul that we speak of in the New Testament that we have as humans, because there's a distinction between men and animals. In fact, we are very distinct from all of the animals. The word nephesh in the Old Testament occurs over 730 times, so it's relatively common. And in these variety of usages, many of them refer to the animals, and as we see on this day, it refers to these swarming creatures. It would be the most important aspect or the most important characteristic of animals animals. It's that animates them. It's that gives them, you might even say, personality in some sense. Not in a human sense, but distinction from non-living creatures, and a distinction from life forms like plant life. And some would even say that it is an indicator of a lot of other characteristics as well. So it's translated living beings or living creatures or soul in some context, particularly when it refers to man. Now, man would have nephesh as well, but it is distinct, I think, from that of animals. This is probably the distinction, the major distinction between plants and animals. Now, we as creationists make a big point of death not coming until after sin enters in Genesis chapter 3. Well, animals eat plant life, and they would have eaten plant life before the fall. So there's a distinction. In fact, biblically, it seems that the Bible makes a distinction between plant life, which is different and distinct from animal life. And the concept of death doesn't seem to apply, even though we think of plants as dying. The same concept does not apply biblically. Otherwise, we'd have a conflict in the biblical text. So I think the distinction that makes that distinction is the concept of nephesh. And these are creatures that have that. Then the Hebrew word for flying creatures, oph, it's a general word that refers not only to birds, but creatures that fly. So on this day, God creates flying creatures. Now, one of the things that I've got on your outline sheet, and some of the points that I'd like to make, is day 4, or day 5 rather, just like all of the other days, there's little points in there that refute a lot of aspects, particularly of evolutionary thinking. There's no compatibility with Genesis with any concept of evolutionary thinking. And what I'd like to do is draw out some of those for you so that in your usage of Genesis 1, you will have that available. We want to expound the text as accurately as we can, but we also can see some implications that we can draw. And we want to do this because the majority of the church does not take the viewpoint that we take in terms of Genesis. The majority of the broader church, and even the evangelical church, buys into some form of evolutionary thinking. Either theistic evolution or progressive creationism, or as we mentioned last time, the framework hypotheses, or some of the older, even conservative Christians held to the gap theory, which in some measure puts evolutionary ideas in that gap. Genesis 1, or nowhere in the Bible do we have support for that. So let me give you some points that you can note. I already mentioned one of them. The first cell was not in the ocean. The first life, in fact, God did not create cells per se. So evolution says that the first cell came about as a result of all of the molecules arranging themselves and some energy source like lightning or some charge sparked this whole thing such that the first cell was formed. Now, we know that that is absurd biologically. I'm not going to get into that. But the text is very clear that life did not begin in the oceans. Now, we have ocean life on day 5, but life began, and the origin of life is on day 3. And it was on land, and it has to do with plants. So already you have a drastic conflict with evolutionary thinking. If you just look at the sequence of the 6 days, now I stress this a little bit, but we have the same thing on day 5. I showed you this chart where if you chart on one side of a sheet the evolutionary sequence of events and plot opposite the creation days, you see no continuity whatsoever. It almost seems like God went out of His way to contradict the idea of any evolutionary sequence that would fit into that framework. So this was what we've looked at already. The closest that we have is light comes very early, and we have in the Bible light being created on day 1. But the waters pertaining to the earth, and by the way, Genesis 1 focuses on the earth. Everything else is associated with the earth. Evolutionary ideas put the earth and the creation of the earth way later. After light, after stars, after galaxies, after perhaps other planets, and then amongst planets, the earth. So the sequence doesn't fit. Now, when it comes to day 5, well, even from day 3, fruit trees, very late, seed plants, very late in the evolutionary scheme. And aquatic life doesn't fit. Again, contradictory. And then flying creatures, very, very late in the evolutionary scheme. And according to Scripture, what do we have? We have a specific mention of these large creatures or sea monsters. And again, we would associate them with dinosaurs, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Again, very late. So we have, just a summary here, aquatic and flying creatures at the same time. In the evolutionary scheme, they're separated by billions of years, or millions of years, rather. Birds before the reptiles, which is contrary to evolutionary thinking. Not only that, but we have flying creatures of different varieties. If you believe in evolution, you have to have 4 evolutionary paths that have to be taken just in the area of flying creatures. So you have to have 4 independent evolutionary trails to have the flying creatures that exist today.